Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon stands as one of the greatest albums of all time. This is an album so good that Roger Waters cried when they finished it back in 1973. And now he's done this. He's changed everything. So why? Well, he explains it right here on the new album. First out of respect to the original, but also because the warmongers hadn't got the message the first time around. But as any fan of Pink Floyd will know, the story is much more complicated than that.
Okay. David thinks he owns it. I think he thinks that because I left the band in 1985, that he owns Pink Floyd, that he is Pink Floyd, had nothing that really, I'm irrelevant, and I should just keep my mouth shut and blah. All right.
Disagreements and departures have always been a part of Pink Floyd's history, even going back to their earliest days with their original frontman, Syd Barrett. After the tragic departure of Syd in 1968, the remaining four members embarked on something of a creative journey to try and find their sound without him. Syd was the lead guitarist, main songwriter, and the creative force behind Pink Floyd. So without him, it took some time and some experimentation for them to arrive at something they really felt was complete.
Those of us who were in Pink Floyd at the time experienced it as an existential threat as well. Fuck me, what are we going to do? He writes the bloody songs.
Roger took on the role as main songwriter, at least for the lyrics, and the rest of the band helped to create this experimental sound. And the result was some great music. Their early work is some of their most creative, but it was their 8th album, The Dark Side of the Moon, where everything really came together. Roger's lyrics in particular were much more meaningful and coherent than anything he'd written before, and the unity between all four members of the band helped to create a complete package of music. Dark Side of the Moon was commercially and critically hugely successful, and helped to cement the idea that deeper, more meaningful lyrics could really connect with an audience. I think until then, Roger had been slightly self-conscious about his lyrics, but now was the evidence that not only was he a brilliant songwriter, but he could connect so powerfully with an audience. Dark Side of the Moon in a way gave them everything they ever wanted: commercial success, financial stability, and creative fulfillment, and a feeling of having really achieved something after the difficulty of losing Syd. But after the success of the album, they found themselves in a similar position as before. Where do they go from here? Their following albums are considered by many fans to be their greatest work, and Roger himself calls this the golden years of the band. The lyrical themes they explored on Dark Side of the Moon continue to follow, this time with more of a focus on one specific theme. Wish You Were Here explored relationships, loss, and mental illness, especially relating to Syd. And following this was Animals, a more political album, loosely based on George Orwell's Animal Farm. And whilst the music continued to be as great as ever, the balance in the band wasn't what it once was. Roger was the band's lyric writer at this time, and so many of the thematic direction came from him. Naturally then, the music started to shift from a collaborative project between the four of them into more of what Roger wanted, ultimately ending with The Wall and The Final Cut, essentially a Roger Waters solo album with the other three playing along. I actually really like these albums. I think Roger's lyrics have always been fantastic, but comparing them to the earlier work, it's clear to see that Roger's ideas had taken them away from where they originally were. Naturally then, there would be disagreements between Roger and the other members. One of the most notable examples of this disagreement came with the song Comfortably Numb. Roger had his idea for how he wanted it to sound, and David had his.
We had a quite serious disagreement about the recording of Comfortably Numb. We had made a rhythm track, so that would be like drums, bass, guitar, whatever. And I loved it. And he thought it wasn't precise enough rhythmically, and recut the drum track and there's something else and said, there, that's better. And I listened to it and I went, no, it's not. I hate that. And he went, oh, it's so that was all the disagreement was. And in the end, the track that is on the record is, you know, the first verse is from the version I liked and the second verse is from the version he liked, and then there's a bit of chorus from my one and a bit of it.
David Gilmour's debut solo album, About Face, was released in 1984, and was a long overdue opportunity for him to address his feelings on a number of topics, including his relationship with Roger. In the same year, there was a meeting to discuss the future of the band, but not only did they fail to reach an agreement, they left the meeting with a different understanding of what would happen next. Nick, David and Rick thought there would be a brief hiatus and the band would one day continue. Roger left the meeting thinking that the band was finished. Roger ultimately decided to leave and made an attempt to dissolve the band and stop them making any further music. An agreement was finally made and Pink Floyd continued to make music without Roger. But Roger's musical drive wasn't dead. He wasn't looking to retire. In fact, he'd gained confidence in his writing and had more to say than ever before.
I mean, they can say anything they want, can't they?
Yes, but do you think they're right?
No, of course I don't think they're right. I mean, who are they to say whether anything is enough or not enough about anything?
The difficulty and trauma in Roger's life began at a very early age. His father was a devout Christian who objected to war, so beginning in 1940, rather than fighting in the Second World War, he chose to drive an ambulance. He met Roger's mother around this time and joined the Communist Party, after which he felt his need to fight the Nazis was more important than his Christian faith, so he went back to the conscription board having changed his mind, and left to go fight in January 1944. The following month he was killed, when Roger was just 5 months old. This was and would always be the most defining moment in Roger's life, and would influence all of his later work. Not only would he be vocal about political issues and current affairs, but war and conflict would be the primary theme in all of his work.
Because I was only 5 months old, so I don't remember. I have no memory of meeting my father or of any connection or of any of that. It's just that I grew up with this enormous hole.
His rebellious nature also began during his childhood years. He didn't like school and the oppressive nature of it, and would often take his frustrations out on his teachers. This, of course, is addressed in Another Brick in the Wall. Roger also followed in his parents' footsteps through activism, and was at one time the chair of the Cambridge Youth Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. This rebellious nature would often show itself during his Pink Floyd days, even in a public setting, confronting fans.
Why doesn't anybody else in here with fireworks just off and let the rest of it get on with it?
As he got older and gained confidence in his writing, he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. This led him to take the wheel of Pink Floyd, taking them away from the psychedelic sound they originally had in the late 60s, into the more dramatic sound of The Wall and The Final Cut. But after Pink Floyd, he had the opportunity to create music on his own terms. He didn't need to answer to anyone else, so he could release solo albums, presented exactly as he wanted. The first of which was The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, a concept album that follows in real time a man having a nightmare of a midlife crisis. I suppose this might be somewhat autobiographical. And 3 years later he released Radio Chaos, a concept album addressing many topical issues including UK politics and the Cold War. And since leaving Pink Floyd in 1985, he hasn't released that much new music, including only 1 album since 1992. His live shows mostly consist of Pink Floyd material, and this earlier work has stood the test of time and left him and the rest of Pink Floyd with this legendary status. And for casual listeners who enjoy the occasional Pink Floyd record, you might think things have settled down a bit. The band reunited in 2005 for one final performance at Live 8, and after the passing of Rick in 2008, the remaining members, Nick and David, joined Roger to appear at one of his live performances of The Wall. And whenever asked about it, it seems as though the falling out from Pink Floyd is all in the past, and they get on well.
We get on fine. I emailed Roger last week about a little question, and we had an email exchange, which was fun.
That is until you see something like this tweet between David and his wife Polly and Roger from earlier this year. You only need to watch one of Roger's live shows or to listen to some of his interviews to realise things really haven't settled down. In fact, for Roger, things are probably more heated than ever before. Roger has always found a way to channel his inner demons and outspoken views into whatever work he's doing. This started with the golden years of Pink Floyd, into his solo music, and most recently, and perhaps most notably, through his concerts. They're all just different vehicles for expressing these ideas. But everything was about to change in 2020, and his next project would be something that even those closest to him thought was crazy.
Fuck! That was going so well. I think I'll keep running. I'll wipe that.
The COVID pandemic forced Roger to put an end to his touring, at least temporarily during lockdown. But despite releasing very little new music, he's probably been more active than any other member of Pink Floyd, especially with the rise of the internet and social media, something Roger has always embraced. Unable to tour in May 2020, he released the first of what would be a series of re-recordings. Mother from the Wall. Those of you who know the original recording know it's quite stripped back anyway, so this new version doesn't sound too different. The description from the video reads, "Social distancing is a necessary evil in COVID world. Watching Mother reminds me just how irreplaceable the joy of being in a band is." But just 2 days after releasing this song, he released this video announcement.
But it did make me think, the fact, I think 1.5 million of you have viewed our new version of Mother, which is lovely. It really warms my heart, I have to say. But it does bring up the question of why is this video not available on a website that calls itself the Pink Floyd website?
For many fans, this may have come as something of a surprise, especially during a time when so many people, including Roger, were looking for connection. Despite this, Roger continued releasing new recordings. The next was Two Suns in the Sunset from the final cut. Again, it's a very stripped back song originally, so this updated version isn't really too different. But the first time that he actually wanted to reinterpret that earlier work came 2 years later, when he released the 2022 version of Comfortably Numb. Sure enough, it's slow and more dreary than the original, which sounds a bit like the version Roger wished the original was. And yes, both guitar solos are missing. After recording a handful of individual songs and occasionally posting them on YouTube, he later suggested to his producer that he wanted to re-record The Dark Side of the Moon. This wasn't going to be a small project during lockdown. This was Roger taking the original idea of the album and interpreting it in a completely different way.
You know what? This record actually deserves a reimagining.
The album itself sounds completely different to the original. Nearly all of the original production ideas have gone, the guitar and saxophone solos have gone, and the pessimist in me says this is Roger taking this beautiful piece of music and just doing it his way, disregarding the teamwork and the collective ideas of the band. Part of what makes the original record so good is the collaborative performance and production of all 4 members, and reimagining this undoes all of that work. This perspective is largely how critics and many of his listeners have seen it, but I think there is more to it than this. The first thing to say is that Roger loves the original, and this redux isn't because he hates how the original sounds, but almost out of respect to the original.
I love the original recording, by the way, and I love what Nicky did and what Rick did and what Dave did on the original recording.
The Dark Side of the Moon is a concept album, perhaps the most famous or successful concept album, and that means there's a unifying theme to it. The songs and the recording sit upon this foundation of an idea, and the music on the record interprets this idea in just one particular way. What Roger has done with this redux is to reinterpret the same concept, and the concept of it aligns with all that Roger has worked on during his life, and more. It isn't a particularly new idea for an artist to revisit their earlier work. I made a video before about Joni Mitchell reinterpreting her song Both Sides Now. The original from the 60s is upbeat, joyful and optimistic, and the recording made 30 years later is slower and more reflective. The same is true for Glenn Gould reinterpreting Bach's Goldberg variations. And this is what Roger has done here.
The new recording is more reflective, I think, and it's more indicative of what the concept of the record was.
Roger has stated that it's meant to amplify the original album. I think he's talking more about the lyrics, about war and conflict, but I think this also applies because the album is a concept album. And by reimagining this album, it shows the value and the importance of this underlying concept.
Not to supersede it or to replace it, but to remember it and as an adjunct to it, and to progress the work of the original concept of the original record and all those original songs.
So why has there been such a negative reaction to this redux? Many people prefer the later recordings by Joni Mitchell or Glenn Gould, but I haven't heard of anyone preferring this version to the original. Well, I think unlike an individual song or piece of music, albums are also products. This isn't just true for Dark Side of the Moon, but it's true for any album. Think of your favourite song or piece of music, and you could probably imagine any artist reinterpreting it in a different way, and it might sound good. But think of your favourite album, and imagine another artist recording that even 10 years before or after, and it wouldn't work. A song or piece of music is just an idea that needs to be interpreted by a performer. But an album is something that is created. And this redux dismantles that original creation. This is also the reason why Dark Side of the Moon is so great, by the way. because it pushed the boundaries of what an album could be. But I wouldn't want anyone to re-record it. It doesn't matter how great an artist they are. It's probably even worse with Pink Floyd because they have such a unique and inventive sound. As said before, Roger doesn't intend for this to replace the original, and there are some moments on here that I really like. Time is one of my favourites. And it does offer a new perspective on the themes of the record, an idea and practice that I really like.
It is a reinterpretation, and I hope that we can gain more from it than we did back in 1973 when it first came out, because it's been part of all of our lives for 50 years, and yet we are still not yet breathing in the air.
But the trouble is that doing this takes the music out of context, and music without its context can lose its meaning very quickly. So what will Roger do next? Re-record another Pink Floyd album? We'll have to see, maybe.
I'll come in when it starts talking about politics.
Okay,
But if this story has taught us anything, it's that Roger will continue to address these same themes he's done throughout his whole life, and the original Dark Side of the Moon still sounds amazing.
Wednesday.